Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. During the previous 24 hours, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine made a very interesting statement. Yesterday he stated the following: "We hold Pokrovsk, we hold Mirnograd, there is no encirclement or blockade of the cities." Chief of the Ukraine Armed Forces Command Syrsky. So he's trying to tell us that everything that the Russians and pro-Russian sources and probably sometimes neutral mappers reported about the situation in the Pokrovsk agglomeration is a lie. So once again, we need to understand one important thing, that currently we are facing not just a regular battle in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. It's not something like the battle for the settlement of, let's say, Berezova or the settlement of Novogrigorovka in the Zaporozhye direction. This is not something like a battle for the settlement of Zvanovka in the Sivir direction. This is not just a regular battle between Russians and Ukrainians. The battle for the Pokrovsk agglomeration, first of all, is a duel. This is a duel between the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, and the Russian Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov. This is, first of all, a duel between these two people. And you need to understand one important thing, at least I understand this like this. So after the end of the battle, depending on the results of battle for the city of Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk agglomeration, one of these persons would be dismissed, either the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, or the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov. So currently, both of them are fighting not for just a regular city, they're fighting for themselves. And this is a very important, let's say, side of the conflict and of this battle. So that is why we see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are interested to finish the battle as soon as possible and as fast as possible, and of course in their favors. Anyway, now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and let's see and let's make most likely conclusions who is going to be dismissed first, Alexander Syrsky or Valery Gerasimov. So, according to information we have during the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions once again. Let's take a look at the map. So, this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 31st of October. This is the situation by the end of the 1st of November. And this is the situation by the beginning of the 2nd of November. So, there are lots of changes, and let's discuss them in details. And first, let's talk about the settlement of Rodinskaya. During the previous 12 hours, 24 hours, the pro-Russian sources published this video, and here we can see how Russians were bombing and attacking the northern part of the settlement of Rodinskaya with aviation. Lots of attacks, lots of explosions, and of course this is a very interesting video because this video tells us that not everything in the northern part of the settlement is under complete Russian control. Either there are still pockets of resistance from Ukrainian side, or Ukrainians, as a result of counter-offensive operation, managed to recapture some positions in the northern part of the settlement of Rodinskaya. So several pro-Russian sources reported that this video is archived. I'm not sure whether this video is archived or not. This video was published just yesterday, so we decided to add this video to map. Furthermore, I would like to point your attention that despite the fact that most of the pro-Russian sources reported that the village of Rodinskaya was completely captured by Russians, we still haven't seen any report from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation on this matter. The Russians, the official Russian authorities, still haven't confirmed control over the settlement of Rodinskaya, which means that there are still very heavy clashes, and that the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation understands that most likely Ukrainians would be able to regain some positions during their counter-attack, so that is why they don't want to be in a hurry with this statement. Furthermore, several neutral mappers confirmed that indeed Ukrainians counter-attacked in the area of the settlement of Rodinskaya in its central part. As a result of this counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to enter the settlement and to dig in deeper in this part. They don't have normal communication with the mainland, and the territories, let's say, along railways and to the north are still in the gray zone or under complete Russian control. So they entered and created a pocket in the northern part of the Rodinskaya. Now Ukrainians are trying to supply this contingent with drones, most likely. So this is the situation. We see that Ukrainians are still attempting to force Russians to fall back from Rodinska. This will allow them to unblock the Ukrainian contingent on the territory of Pokrovsk agglomeration. Syrskyi understands that everything depends on this, and his own career depends on this first of all. From the other side, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the city of Pokrovsk itself, already in the western part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. So let's take a look at the changes once again. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 30th of October, this is 31st of October, this is the 1st of November, and this is the 2nd of November. So what do we have? First of all, we have this video that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, and here we can see how Russian soldiers were moving along railways in the area of the railway station, how Russians were taking additional positions under their control. So this video and this building was geolocated. This is exactly the place where Russians answered to this construction. Furthermore, some neutral mappers confirmed that the territory along the railways is almost under complete Russian control. So based on these two reports, we have adjusted the map and we have colored this territory in the complete Russian control. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions, as you can see, in the northern part of the settlement of Pokrovsk. Now the Russians are trying, as you can see, to outflank the last and the final citadel of the armored forces of Ukraine in the northern part of the city. We're talking about this citadel with high-rise building areas. This is the last citadel of Ukraine, and if Ukrainians lose control over this high-rise building area, then most likely they will lose everything. So now the battle, as you can see, is taking place for the most important area of the city of Pokrovsk, of course, and once again, if Russians establish control over these buildings, over this micro district, and if Russians are able to force Ukrainians to fall back further in the eastern direction, this is going to be the end. This is going to be the end in this configuration, without additional progress on the ground from Ukrainian side in the area of the settlement of Rodinska. And now the Russians are in a hurry. They understand that they need to force Ukrainians to fall back from this stronghold as soon as possible, because this will allow them to dig in deeper, and from these positions Ukrainians will not be able to force them to fall back, and they will not be able to counterattack and to regain these territories. Furthermore, the Russians, according to different mappers, finished to clear the settlement by the name of Rih. So maybe today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information. Another important piece of news and another important signal is that today several sources and several mappers reported that Ukrainians began withdrawing their positions from the most southern part of the pocket, from the most southern part of this cauldron, from the territory of the village by the name of Sukhoy Yar. I would like to remind you that these territories used to be under control of the 25th Airborne Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. They were completely encircled, and there is a huge gap between their positions in the southern part of Mirnograd, and the fact that they began retreating means a lot. It means that Ukrainians are trying to shorten their lines, and they're trying to stick and to get as close as possible to the main evacuation roads, and the withdrawal of position from the southern part means that most likely in coming days the situation will start developing much faster. So Russians began testing Ukrainian positions in this area, trying to understand whether every single Ukrainian abandoned this territory or not. Furthermore, we start receiving reports from the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation that the first groups of the armored forces of Ukraine began surrendering. So we see that we are entering the final part of the battle for the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and we understand and we see that sooner or later everything will be finished, or sooner or later a critical point will be crossed without any chances to return the situation back, and then this is going to be most likely the end of the battle. At the same time, the sources are saying that Russians began counter-offensive operation in the area of the village by the name of Shakhova. I would like to remind you that during the previous 3 or 4 days, Ukrainians were reporting that Russians were retreating from this territory and that Ukrainians were counter-attacking. So this is, for example, the situation by the end of the 26th of October, and this is approximately the day of the beginning of the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation in this area, at least according to pro-Ukrainian mappers. So this information was confirmed just by them. Nobody else confirmed this information. This is the situation by the end of the 28th of October. This is the situation by the end of the 30th of October. This is the 31st of October. And this is the 1st of November. And starting from the 1st of November, the Russians launched their own counterattack. And as a result of first days or first hours of clashes, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Now we believe that the Russians will continue a counteroffensive. They need to unblock their contingent in the western part of the settlement of Shakhova. So now most likely Ukrainians will retreat under the pressure of the armed force of the Russian Federation. So very heavy clashes in this area continue. Now let's discuss the situation in the Zaporozhye direction, where Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, small changes on the ground were recorded in the area of the settlements of Danilovka. So these are the changes that were provided by different mappers. The Russians continue advancing in the direction of the road R85. The Russians are attacking using the broad frontline attack. Furthermore, the Russians began advancing an offensive operation in the southern part, in the southern direction of the settlement by the name of Uspenovka. So now the Russians are trying to establish complete control over this dense network of the fortifications between Okhotnitsy and Novouspienovskaya. This is a very important chain of defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, and if Russians can capture this chain, then most likely Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this entire direction. Very interesting details are coming from the Liman direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources published 2 videos how they were attacking Ukrainian forces in the northern part of the settlement of Yampol. And furthermore, several neutral mappers confirmed that Ukrainians launched their major counter-offensive operation in this direction, and as a result of this counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to restore almost complete control over the settlement by the name of Yampol. So the Russians are saying that these 2 videos are also, let's say, archived videos, but we have too many proofs and too many confirmations of Ukraine counterattack. So anyway, another important thing that the 60% of the settlement of Yampol used to be considered as a gray zone. Most of the pro-Russian sources already colored these territories as territories under complete Russian control without proof. So that is why we basically adjusted the gray zone back under control of the armed forces of Ukraine. So almost nothing has been almost nothing changed in this area, but anyway, a very important detail. Another important information is coming from the area of the villages of Novoselovka, Alexandriivka. The Russians during the previous 24 hours improved their positions in this area as well. And the most important is that the Russians began advancing in the Svetogorsk forest in the direction of the settlements of Sosnovo and Alexandriivka, and of course in the direction of the territory between the villages of Yarov and Svetogorsk. The Russians are tasked to ruin Ukrainian logistics and to cut the settlement of Novoselovka from supply and support. Russians need to take this corner under complete control. This will allow them to block the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine completely. And only after this situation they will be able to begin offensive operation, real offensive operation in the direction of the city of Liman. As for the Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, additional changes were recorded. The Russians began advancing in the northern part of the settlement of Kupiansk, trying to push the Ukrainians from this territory. This information was confirmed by pro-Russian sources and by neutral mappers. The Russians were holding the Kupiansk direction under the siege for many days, and now the Russians believe that it's time to begin offensive operation because the Ukrainians are too exhausted and they will not be able to show any resistance. So as you can see, during the previous day, huge changes were recorded in the most northern part of the settlement, and we believe that in coming days Ukrainians will continue retreats further in the southern direction towards the settlements of Kupiansk, Uzlavoy, and towards the village of Podole. So furthermore, I would like to remind you that 3 or 4 days in a row, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation is saying that the Russians are about to finish the clearing operation in the settlement of Petropavlovka and Kurilovka. And of course, if this information is being confirmed, obviously for Ukrainians it's better to stay as close as possible to the river Voskol and to its southern part of this pocket, with the purpose to have at least some chances for evacuation. So we see that the greatest retreat of Ukrainians has begun in this direction as well. But I would like to point your attention and to remind you that yesterday Zelensky stated that Russians have already lost the battle for Kupiansk. Currently it's very difficult to understand what Zelensky Zelensky was talking about. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.